welcome back to Bite Marks. And on today's special episode, we have a very special guest. Allow me to introduce you to Kitbosh. Say hello, Kitbosh.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here today.
For those of you who aren't familiar with some of our earlier work, I am a wargamer. I'm very interested in wargames. And Kitbosh here is a very good YouTube channel. You should definitely check out his work. Why don't you tell the viewers at home about your channel and what it is that you do?
Okay, well, I work with Warhammer and Warhammer 40k miniatures, personalizing them. It's generally referred to as kit bashing or conversions. Kit bashing because you take two different kits and you combine them to get something that's different than the original. So a simple version would be just swapping out a helmet for another one you like. I tend to do much more ambitious projects than maybe I have the ability to achieve all the time. So I like making extremely large space orcs, and kit bashing and conversion is really about trying to make something new.
I have to say, you have some of the best Xbox huge orcs I think I've seen basically ever. You guys at home really have to look at them. If you've seen orcs in Warhammer 40k, you've generally seen that they can be big. I think Gazkul is probably the biggest orc model that is currently available. Kitbosh over here will take some of the biggest models that he can find and bolt on armor and muscle, and it's really interesting. My only lament is that you can never get a quite big enough head.
That is a constant source of problems for me. I've looked at different options. Someone just now suggested making silicon molds and expanding them, which maybe I'll try, but yeah, they always have very small heads. Nobody makes appropriately huge orc heads.
It's a shame because the models that you do make are really, I hate to say this, but they're actually very gorgeous to look at. And for viewers at home, I will be in the minority of this opinion, but I actually prefer them unpainted. I feel like you can see the care and craft that went into making them when they're unpainted. Whereas when they are painted, even though they quote unquote might look better, I feel as if it hides a lot of the hard work that goes into making them. And I'm not much of a painter myself, so maybe that's why I quite like it.
Yeah, you are very much in the minority, though I appreciate it. I think every other comment on my channel is asking me to. I understand why, because it's such everyone who has an army or model has painted them, but it's such an investment in time that I don't. It's not the part of the model I really enjoy.
For me, I play war games. I get into this hobby for two things. The first reason is to play the game. I very much like playing war games. I like the experience, like the stories that it can tell. And the second reason is to collect the miniatures. But I can play the game without having miniatures, and I can collect miniatures without playing the game. But painting, for me, is an entirely separate skill, and one that I've never really been good at. So I actually, there are other war game channels. I think Pete the Wargamer is one, where they do very good paint jobs on their miniatures. But I feel as if there's something very just creative about the art of kit bashing, and to focus specifically on kit bashing as a whole, I think is a niche. And maybe that explains why your channel has really been blowing up in popularity these past couple of weeks.
Yeah, I had it's interesting. The YouTube algorithm really latched onto it and kind of catapulted it, which I'm very grateful about. We'll see where it goes, because the really popular Warhammer channels are either lore channels or painting channels. But I like the response I've been getting so far.
Or battle report channels, I do watch a lot of those. I think I watch those and not lore channels for reasons that will become a little bit more obvious when we continue with the podcast. But let me tell the viewers at home why I decided to bring you on. So my distaste of a lot of Warhammer is, I think, fairly well known. But you made a video recently that I thought was really interesting, and judging by the comment section, even more interesting. And that is, you committed the cardinal sin of Warhammer 40k. You tried to make female space marines. Why don't you tell the viewers about that?
Yeah, that's the ultimate heresy, in universe and out, apparently. I think that female space marines are kind of the iconic, most illustrative topic for the reactionary part of the Warhammer fan base. I really just wanted to create something cool, and I think it's a missed opportunity that there aren't female Space Marines. So I thought it would be interesting to try to marry the design language of Space Marines, which are large and hulking, to like a little bit more of a feminine silhouette. Because I understand, so a lot of people just add male or female heads to male Space Marines, and I think that's an entirely valid way of going about it, and probably even how they would look in the lore. It's not very noticeable outside the armor, but tabletop gaming is really a visual medium, so I thought it would be interesting to try to do that, and then the comment section exploded.
If I recall correctly, you said it was your most disliked video on the channel?
By several orders of magnitude. Most of my videos hang out at like 97 to 98% likes to dislikes, and that one I think is at like 84 to 87.
I made a video criticizing Arch Warhammer, and that video was brigaded by his fans, and I think it is my most disliked video. It'll probably be my most disliked video ever, because people would just come in, say some terrible things, and dislike the video and then leave. But jokes on them. The YouTube algorithm is indifferent to vitriol.
To dislikes like that.
Yeah, it actually probably drives engagement, in a way. So I really want to.
Also, what's interesting about it is it's a particular issue for people. So, for example, I did another video where I did Tau Space Marines, which are people who don't know, they're a Xeno faction, they're an alien faction who would never have Space Marines. Like, that makes no sense.
Yeah.
But I saw some concept art for it, and I thought it was cool. And a lot of people in the comments were like, "Oh, this is really cool," but it didn't hit them in the same like, you're infringing on their lore and culture in the same way that female Space Marines do.
For a little bit of reference, viewers, the Tau faction believe in an ideology called the greater good, and for that reason, they are almost always referred to as communists, even though that's not really what their ideology is actually about. But it is quite telling, that a group of people who are dedicated to technology and very against the kind of things that Space Marines, stand for, honor before reason, violence before diplomacy, that they would be more accepting of that than they would of, a female Space Marine. And to get into it, I thought we would first establish our credentials by talking a little bit about lore. So for those of you who are unaware, the Space Marines were created by the Emperor of Man in a dark and tumultuous period of history called the Unification Wars. The Earth had fallen into depravity, into a kind of apocalyptic wasteland, and the Emperor was trying to get everyone to stop fighting. And so naturally, he thought the best idea was to make super soldiers so that he could murder everyone who wouldn't, bend the knee. And he created these creatures, these beings called Thunder Warriors, who are, in the lore, as we know them, stronger and better killers than the Space Marines. But the cost of this is that they are a lot more unstable and a lot more prone to, various problems. And in a classic storytelling arc, at the end of the Unification Wars, he kills all of them and wipes the slate clean for the Space Marines as we know them. Space Marines are created by a process of gene seed implantation. Basically, they take an adolescent boy, sometimes I think they're actually very young, and they psychologically indoctrinate them, and then they put an organ into them that makes them grow big and strong. And they can sometimes take on unique traits relative to the organ. Like, for example, if they get injected with a salamander organ, the salamanders being a kind of Space Marine, their skin will turn like jet black. Or if they get injected with a Blood Angels gene seed, they will kind of become anime space vampires. So the problem, of course, as it has been expounded upon in probably the comments under this video, is that you can't make a female Space Marine because the gene seed implant, the way that it works is it was only ever coded to work with males. If you put a gene seed into a woman, instead of turning them into a Space Marine, it would probably kill them. Now to that, I have a counter argument that I think is actually fairly compelling, and if you'll permit me, I'll get into it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So tell me, do you know who Fabius Bile is?
Yeah, he is a Chaos Space Marine who does a lot of flesh mongering genetic experiments.
In a way, yeah, he kind of does what you do. He kit bashes humans.
That's very true, but in a little bit more of a grimdark way.
Yeah, you don't have a cloak of skin, do you?
I wouldn't have come on this podcast if I knew I was going to get questions like this. You shouldn't ask people personal questions like that.
Don't worry, I'm not a part of the Arbites. Yes. So Fabius Bile is a really interesting character, I think, because he's kind of a Dr. Frankenstein of 40K. He was a medical figure, an apothecary in a Space Marine legion called the Emperor's Children. But when the rest of the legion fell to chaos, he didn't quite do that. Yes, he rejects the Emperor, but he doesn't do so on a blind devotion to chaos, but rather a desire to, quote-unquote, make humanity greater than what it is now. And so Fabius spends a lot of his time doing engineering and kit bashing to perfect humanity. And, one of the interesting things that he does is he produces superhumans, right? Many of Fabius's experiments produce beings that are human but plus. A great example of this are his gland hounds. So what I find interesting about the gland hound is that they are superhumans. They are essentially less potent versions of Space Marines in a way. They are strong and reasonably fast and pretty good warriors, but they are made, get this, by using Astartes gene seed, and it works on males and females. So gland hounds can be both. They can be anyone. And what I think this proves is that Fabius, working on his own with whatever limited resources that he has, could find a way to use Astartes gene seed in a way that could be applied to anyone, in a way that I'm pretty sure the Imperium could do if it had the gumption to do that. Does that surprise you? Do you think?
Interesting, because it's interesting because I looked into the lore a little bit before this, and so technically speaking, the female Space Marines are possible. They happen in the lore, but the idea is that they're much more difficult to get working than male Space Marines. So the Emperor just kind of put them by the wayside. So they're entirely possible. There's no real reason that issue of stability couldn't be fixed.
Yeah, because we know that the Emperor discarded his Thunder Warriors for firstborn Space Marines, because even though the Space Marines were weaker and not as good fighters, they were more susceptible to what the Emperor needed them to be. And that really brings me to something that I think I wanted to pick your brain on, and that is, I think Space Marines exist in the way that they do, not because of any biological reasons, right? Because every time someone starts talking to me about the science of, chromosomes and stuff like that, it's very obvious that they don't know what they're talking about. They never know what they're talking about as to who is, quote unquote, a bio female and a bio male. I think Space Marines exist for ideological reasons. You see, what is a Space Marine? It is primarily a vulnerable young boy who is taken from his family, or in some cases they live in abject terrible living conditions in one of the Imperium's many hives, and they get psychologically indoctrinated to believe in the particular vision that the Emperor required them to in a world of ultra violence, and they get turned into controllable killing machines. And in the process of doing that, they become something more than human, but also something less than human, right? It's worth noting that many of the Space Marines that exist are, I think, aware of the fact that they are defending a version of humanity that they themselves can't actually be a party to. Do you think I'm off the mark there?
No, I think you're entirely correct. I think the Space Marines are interesting in that they're the kind of hyper soldierized masculinity. Though it's not something that novels really talk about too much, but it's that brotherhood that gets kind of like a cult. And I don't think female Space Marines would necessarily break that up, but I think it's definitely an aspect of their character.
I totally, I never thought about it in that way, that the Space Marines are, this ideological machine. But it makes perfect sense, because if the goal is to simply have the best warriors that you can have, right, then we would expect Space Marines to be, a lot stronger than they actually are. It's only recently that Space Marines have been given multiple wounds as standard, in the lore. Previously, they used to be very, very similar to the baseline humans that they're supposedly better than, having one wound and, so on and so forth. So I've always found it, odd that you will tell someone, hey, you could still have, a female Space Marine, and you wouldn't really have to give up a lot of what you'd expect, because we could imagine that the process that makes the female Space Marine is the same as the process that makes the male one. They're still indoctrinated. They're still, transhuman in a way that makes them less than human. The only difference is that maybe one of them speaks with a very deep, but very feminine voice instead of a masculine voice. I don't really see how fundamentally that changes everything.
I think that's very true. There's, I think, a few things. First, people don't really understand how mutable gender is, and that it's not as intractable in general. Biologically speaking, it's not all fetuses are female at some point, for example.
Yeah.
And it's not as ingrained as people really like to think it is. This is something that's come up a lot with trans issues in the last 10 years, is just people understanding that it's not as intractable. And also, Warhammer is not a scientifically rigorous sci-fi setting. Everything in it is just, and it's not even like it has a magic system that is somewhat internally consistent, like the warp. It's like whenever they want it, they find a dark age of humanity archaeotech that can just do whatever it wants.
Oh yeah,
so
yeah.
To say that like this is not biologically possible, it's clearly a decision on the part of the creators. And I don't know if you want to transition to this yet, but creators create. It's not the other way around. You, as an author, are the one who makes the rules, and you can just change it, especially in a setting as mutable as Warhammer.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up, I was reading one of the Mechanicus books, and in it, there's a technological marvel called the Speranza, and it's described as being capable of doing things that violate the laws of reality. So, yeah, clearly, 40K is not a setting that actually is as internally consistent as it actually appears. And, that is a very good segue. Are you familiar with something called the Thermian argument?
I don't believe so.
So the Thermian argument is basically something happens in the lore the way that it happens because someone wrote it to happen that way, right? So whenever you or I make the claim, hey, maybe we could have female Space Marines, and someone says, but the lore, the Emperor foretold in his stone obelisk that that Space Marines would be a dude-only club. They're making an appeal to lore, but they're forgetting, of course, as you rightly said, people wrote the lore. We didn't get Warhammer 40K delivered to us on high from, the God Emperor himself. Some nerds in a room had to write all of this stuff, and presumably, I don't think they realized just, what consequences they would have by coming up with this interesting setting, because people treat it as if it's immutable. But I want to give a good example of where I think that's actually terrible thinking, and that is, of course, Age of Sigmar. Are you familiar with Age of Sigmar?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with it as I am with Warhammer and the old fantasy universe, but I'm relatively familiar with the basics.
So, for those of you who are, again, unfamiliar, Age of Sigmar is a reboot of the traditional Warhammer fantasy setting, and the idea is kind of to take out all of the kitchen sink of tropes, to basically throw out Tolkien and embrace something new. Many of the settings factions are very different. For example, you've got a race called the Ideneth Deepkin. What are they? Well, they are elves who live at the bottom of the ocean. They are soulless because of how they were created, and so they constantly need to feed on souls. They have a society which is structured based on how much of a soul you have, which is a very unusual thing. And visually, they have amazing models because they have units that ride sharks into battle on a magical sea that pervades the environment. It really is something to look at. To go from fairly grounded, fairly, realistic units that wouldn't really be out of place in a Lord of the Rings to, okay, we're elves, we're going to ride giant sharks into battle, and it's going to be awesome,
Yeah, certainly. And I think Age of Sigmar has really opened up the possibilities for the tabletop, the models that Games Workshop is able to put out. I mean, not only do I love the Deepkin and their aesthetic language, but also the Night Haunts. Those are some fantastic models. The way the static figures look like they're in movement.
Yeah, it goes to show you what you can do when you disregard design language that has become kind of dogmatic, where you decide we're going to do something different and then you actually do it. I brought up the Age of Sigmar because they have a faction which is sometimes rightfully, sometimes wrongfully called the Sigmarines, right? The Stormcast Eternals. Now, if you've never seen a Stormcast Eternal, they look very similar to a Space Marine. They're big, bulky people in fantasy power armor with crossbows that kind of look like bolters and big weapons that kind of glow, and they really have a Space Marine aesthetic to them. But they go a lot beyond that, because not only can anyone basically be a Stormcast Eternal, but many of the Stormcast Eternals are women. They are just made that way. The process that makes them is capable of working on anyone. And so it's not so much, what you are, it's what you really want to become. And so I feel as if the fact that we can do this, that Games Workshop can actually change, lore in such a meaningful way, kind of means that they don't want to. And so here's where I wanted to also pick your brain. Why is it, do you think, that Games Workshop has been hesitant, to do something to make, let's lay our cards on the table here, to make Warhammer 40K more inclusive? Because, firstly, do you think Warhammer has a kind of way, a kind of feeling, or maybe a kind of vibe that pushes people away from it? People that might be, women, people that might be, people of color, something like that. And then why do you think they do that?
So I think there's a couple aspects of that. I think definitely the reactionary portion and the sort of pseudo-fascist, well, not pseudo-fascist, the fascistic setting do push people away sometimes. And I think straight white males and people with privilege often don't take into account how important representation is and how you're attracted to a work because they are constantly represented. I know for myself, as someone who is Hispanic, anytime a Hispanic character comes on TV, I light up a little bit, especially when I was younger. And I have female friends, and I'll show them the different models I'm making, and they're always impressed. I mean, not to puff myself up, they're always impressed. But
you deserve a little bit. You do make some good models.
Well, thank you. But they're always especially interested when there's a female model I'm making, and that kind of just makes sense. They like to see themselves represented. And so I think it is something where it would open up the hobby more if there was more inclusion of female models. And I think it would be a good business decision in the long term. But often big companies like Games Workshop, like you said, they're sort of focused on short-term profit. They don't really think long-term like that. And I think it comes down to three big things for them. I think on the one hand, scared of their fan base. I mean, the Primaris Marines, which are basically just Marines, for those who don't know, they're Space Marines who basically got updated with some new armor. And that was a massive deal in the Warhammer community that a lot of people didn't like, even though they're just Space Marines, but a little newer looking.
Yeah, they look more like Space Marines are supposed to look like, in a way, right? Because that's
what's amazing about them, is that they're essentially just true scale Space Marines, which is a term that originally the Space Marine models, the proportions don't make sense. They're the same height as normal humans on the tabletop.
And they're actually kind of skinny.
I think somebody referred to them once as chibi Marines because their proportions are kind of like cutesy almost, and their pelvis essentially just doesn't function if you look at it. Yeah. It's one of the problems with using them for conversions is they don't look correct. So they're basically just an upgrade to make the Marines look better.
Yeah.
A lot of people have problems with them. And so I think there's an extent to which Games Workshop does not want to have to deal with the backlash that they know would come from it. And I think also it's something where they're a company who is largely old white guys, and so
Hmm.
they don't necessarily don't look at the world in a way where they're like, okay, we need to make it more expansive for people as a whole, and you know, their viewpoint is still very much tied up in we're just going to make things that we think are kind of cool, but we're not necessarily going to try to look deeper than that. That's kind of my view on it, is that it's sort of calcified at the top.
Hmm. I to go on some of that, so some of your points. I think one of the problems with Games Workshop and the way that the fan base reacts to the lore is there has been a symbiotic but negative relationship where Games Workshop has kind of for years tried a strategy of appealing to the same number of people but getting them to double down on their spending, right? Why do they continuously
Very
release
much so.
books? Why do they continuously, do this and do that? Why do they pander to Space Marines? Well, the answer is because in the short term, those are the fans with all the money, and those are the fans who spend the money. And obviously, that's unsustainable because right now it feels like Horus Heresy, 2 Electric Boogaloo, because basically every person that I know that has an army plays Space Marines. So if I want to, come and bring, an Orc army or a Tau army or anything that isn't the meta, I will have to either play really, really well or I will get trounced to someone that has, a 3 wound Terminators with a 2+ armor save and, maybe a 3+ invul save. And I feel as if, it's a short-term strategy because that's kind of what makes money. A long-term strategy of trying to build the fan base into something else, to build a fan base into something that appeals to many, many more people will take a lot of time and money, and it's kind of uncertain. As you said, if games, here's my pitch. I think that what they could have done when they released the Primaris Marines is they could have just come out and said, these Primaris Marines, yeah, some of them are women. They were originally designed that way because Belisarius Krall doesn't like being limited by, these pathetic backwards thinking. He wants to think of the future, man. He wants to think of what can I do better than, what was done before. And, the answer is double the potential gene pool. You double the potential recruiting pool for, Primaris Marine. And I think that could have been the way to be updating everything, in a goal. Yeah, sure, maybe most of the Marines are, male, but maybe some of them, and maybe they could release a couple of models that, yeah, that's just a woman in power armor, and she looks no different, really. Because here's the thing. I think you should walk our viewers a little bit through the actual design that you made, because I feel it would ground some of their understanding. So how did you set about designing a female Space Marine?
Well, so first, I entirely agree. I think that's when female Marines should have been introduced, is with the Primaris. It makes sense in terms of the lore and in terms of there's already going to be new Marines.
Yeah.
In terms of the model itself, the way I did it is that a lot of people, if they want female Space Marines, they just add female heads to existing Marines. Mm. And I think that's an entirely valid way of doing it. I don't think that there needs to be a lot of sexual dimorphism in terms of the actual model. I think, realistically speaking, female Marines would look basically like male Marines, but with female heads.
Yeah, pretty much.
Tabletop gaming is a visual medium, and I wanted to do something that looked both female, but also had the design language of kind of the big hulking Space Marines. So what I did is I took some Stormcast legs, some Stormcast female legs.
Of course.
And basically, because those are a good... Stormcast in general can be ported over to being Marines very easily. And I tried to I used Space Marine Scout torsos because they have a little bit of a smaller waist and a deep chest. I put those on top of them, and that worked really well. And normal Space Marine limbs could go onto those quite well. And I like what I came up with. I do think they're pretty cool. I would have liked to try and... There's a piece of concept art I use at the beginning, which I think is an ideal female Space Marine, which is that she's very angular and large, but there's a kind of speed and weight to her design. And I've actually been experimenting more with trying to get something closer to that in the future. And I think it's difficult. It's obviously a challenge because there just aren't just finding good female heads in Games Workshop's lineup is actually really difficult.
Oh yeah, for all the talk, because every time people like you and I, every time we come out and make these kinds of statements, maybe the game should be more inclusive. Maybe we can still keep the grim darkness, without having to be this crazy. Because I should note that very few factions in the game are exclusive in the way that the Imperium is. The Eldar were once a galaxy-spanning empire, but they have male and female models represented more or less, to a large degree. Any Eldar under, their armor could be male or female. You just have no way of knowing. And yet there are still a substantial number of important female characters in the lore. But when it comes to the Imperium, and maybe this is your complaint as a whole, because they have problems with heads. You can never find a big enough orc head.
That's very true. They have an upgrade sprue for female Stormcasts, which I applaud, but A, they're expensive, and B, they don't actually look that good.
Yeah, exactly.
Good third party. A few good third party heads. There's one from a company called Statuesque Miniatures, but theirs tend to look kind of young. There's a person on Shapeways who has some 3D models that I'm ordering that hopefully look pretty good and a little bit more stern and Space Marine-y. We'll see how that turns out.
I think it's also perhaps important here to talk a little bit about the Sisters of Battle, because I think invariably what's going to happen is, even if we do successfully make a case that, the Primaris Marines should have been integrated, Belisarius Call is not one to be held back by he's not going to be outdone by Fabius Bile, of all people. Then everyone would, raise a fuss and go, well, what about the Sisters of Battle? Well, here are my thoughts, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. I think the Sisters of Battle actually are a weird missed opportunity. They only exist in the lore because of a loophole. The Imperial Church, the Ecclesiarchy, is not allowed to have men under arms. Now, they did the most rules lawyery way interpretation possible and just meant men only, and so they get around this limitation because they were involved in numerous infighting in Civil War by just saying, we don't have men under arms, we have women under arms, right? And they create the Sisters of Battle. So the Sisters have, they wear power armor. Granted, it is very well shaped, shall I say. But the thing about them has always been that they aren't Space Marines. They are not, augmented. They're not really super duper, killers. And as time has gone on, they've only become, a lot more differentiated from Space Marines. But the thing that really separates them is piety. So I think in a world where there are, male or female Space Marines, I think you could have had male or female Sisters of Battle. The thing that makes them important is their piety, their blind devotion to the Emperor as a god, which I should mention, many Space Marines do not think that the Emperor was a god. They just worship him or venerate him as like a really, really good human. Many of them reject the idea of, the imperial godhood. What do you think about that?
I think there's a couple. So this isn't what you're saying, but often I see an argument for when the topic of female Space Marines comes up is people are like, well, we already have the Sisters of Battle, we don't need them, and we don't need male Sisters of Battle. And I think there's two things to talk about there. The first is that, as you were saying, in the lineup, female Sisters of Battle aren't just an all-female army. They're almost the only female army. They're almost one of the few armies that actually has female figures at all. So for example, the Imperial Guard in the lore has a lot of women in it, but none of the models do.
Yeah.
So there's an issue of representation there, I think, where it's important to that it's important, I think, that there are female models there. The thing with the female Sisters of Battle is that, like the Xeno factions, they're not given the same amount of attention as Space Marines. They're just not. Space Marines have multiple armies. Yeah, and that's why sometimes people are like, well, they should just strengthen the Sisters of Battle instead of giving us male Space Marines. It's not going to happen. It just isn't. There's multiples. There's a Space Wolf armies. There's Blood Angel armies. There's Grey Knight armies. There's one version of the Sisters of Battle.
Yeah, I have.
They're rather sexualized.
I have Dark Angels. I really like the green. I'm a big fan of green. But Yeah, I think the reason why the Sisters of Battle exist as they do is because of very particular, very niche reasons. If, hypothetically, the Space Marines had always been integrated from the start, then the Sisters of Battle as we know them would never exist. There would never have been a reason to make a army specifically built in the way that the Sisters are if the setting was integrated from the beginning, right? That is something that we have to
they're
recognize.
Very specifically not. They're very specifically female Space Marines, but not Space Marines.
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of their design language.
They were designed not from the beginning because they were sort of included not from the very very beginning, but fairly early on. And I think maybe I don't know. I hate to throw this this idea out there, but maybe there is a little bit of gender essentialism. Maybe the idea is that only men can really be these cold, efficient, ruthless killing machines. By the way, that's not true. Look at the Horus Heresy. Everyone is emotional in the Horus Heresy. And the Sisters of Battle are portrayed as being terribly.
It is.
Oh yeah,
it's funny. I had not thought of that, but that is very true. In that the Space Marines are very stoic, and the Sisters of Battle are very extra and dramatic, and that is a certain amount.
Yeah, whenever
essentialism.
Yeah, whenever you read about descriptions of them fighting, it's always the Space Marines advanced coolly, executing their targets with pinpoint bolt accuracy, and then the Sisters of Battle, like they raged and howled and charged at the enemy in like a violent fury. It's like whoa.
That is actually very funny. I think more than that, there's one interpretation of women soldiers in that setting, which is the Sisters of Battle, whereas it's the classic thing where men get a wide variety of representation and women get one representation. And even if that one representation can't be problematic if there were a lot of options, it's problematic because that's the only one. I'm actually currently working on a kit bash where I take Sisters of Battle and I try to do kind of what are done with different Space Marine chapters where they have different looks and different and stuff, and trying to do a little bit less boob plate because I kind of hate boob plate.
It makes no sense from a military perspective, because if you're forging plate armor, you don't want there to be these places where something could deflect into or deflect up from. Because they don't wear helmets.
If you just look at it's very true, and also it's just if you look at historically armor, that's not a thing. It just is not a thing in history. So and I understand that, there's a certain amount of fantasy in. Well, actually, this is an interesting point, I think, with the Sisters of Battle, which is that obviously there is a certain amount of fantasy that goes into how these miniatures are built and what the art portrays. But the problem with the Sisters of Battle is that they're a male fantasy of how fighting nuns would look cool. They're not a female fantasy. Like one of my friends, she very much likes the design of like armor with a gown, kind of the skirt and the armor with it, but not in the way that they look, where they're kind of like BDSM-y nuns a little bit. And I think that's something people miss a lot, is that all of the Warhammer miniatures are designed with a very male gaze.
Yeah, it's it's just like, for example, how out of all of the 20 original Space Marine legions, only one of them is explicitly coded in a non-European way, and that's Jagatai Khan and the White Scars. Actually, they're one of the armies that I really wanted to start, but Space Marine bikes are incredibly expensive, and I really like them. Right, they are very interesting. I very much find them appealing. They've got toolbars and really interesting uniforms. Jagatai Khan's model in the art is one of the most interesting suits of power armor I've seen, because it incorporates silk and fine cloth and all of these other things. I'd love to see an actual recreation of it. But out of the 20, there's only one. So if you're a person who looks at this and goes, okay, well, throughout the entire breadth of human experience, the vast majority of the Space Marines are all European coded. You range from like the blonde-haired Ubermensch of like Robote Guilliman and Sanguinus to the more, conventionally broody like Conrad Kurz and, or
the Nordic Space Wolves.
Yeah, or the Nordic Space Wolves. Even Vulcan, right? Vulcan is not like I can't believe we have to say this, but Vulcan is not a black person. he's just he's just a
Yeah, well,
person who has very dark
that's what's
skin.
hilarious is everyone thought there was a black Space Marine Legion, and then in the lore they were like, no, we're taking that away.
Yeah, yeah. The if you
Because initially everyone thought dark skin meant African.
yeah, if you look at Vulcan, if you look at the salamanders, they are very much definitely like Greek in a way. Vulcan is not, an African person. He's like Hephaestus. He's just a Greek person. The fact that their skin is devoid of melanin, or does it have too much? I can never remember which one is which. Is a stylistic choice that is meant to make them look monstrous, right? They have jet black skin and dark red eyes. They're not human in a way. They're not like
They're inhuman.
yeah, they're inhuman. They're not like a good example are the Celestial Lions. The Celestial Lions are an African Space Marine chapter. They have iconography that is distinctly African. They have leadership and culture and symbology that reflects, oh, we come from like a savannah, Our people have a interesting tribal structure. We have our own honor dances. We have our own, symbols and meaning, and we have our own leaders, and they have names that are, African sounding. And what happens to them? They get butchered to a man by the Inquisition.
It's funny you should mention them because just last night I was reading up on their lore because I was thinking about trying to convert some with a little bit of African motifs. And yeah, they get
brutalized.
To put it nicely, they get shit on by all of the. Yeah, they're really bad. And I think also something to bear in mind is that it's nice in the lore when people get representation. So anyone any race in the lore can be a Space Marine.
Yeah,
which is kind of contrasting with the whole women can't. But tabletop gaming is a visual medium, so you really need to have that expressed in the models themselves if you want to have inclusion in terms of other cultures and races.
Yeah, one of the things that makes 40K interesting, because I've played other war games before. I've played War Machine. I've played War Master. By the way, I'm really into War Master. 10 millimeter wargaming. That's my new jam. But because the model, there's a quick aside here, but there's a place that I'm trying to get some miniatures from. Excellent Miniatures. They have high elven models that are just really nice, and also you have a visual representation. There are male and female elves in the spear line, which is what is kind of represented in Thor, and that's just like, I never actually saw that when I was playing Warhammer. But I digress.
Well, no, it's good to know. I might rate them for some bits that I can use.
It's 10 millimeter in scale, so it's a lot smaller than you might be used to working with. But I like it because I like having big armies. And they're much cheaper than regular 28 millimeter miniatures are. But anyway, I get sidetracked. The point I was making is that the whole point about Warhammer, the whole reason why it's constructed the way that it is so that you can have your guys on the table. The point of 40K being this big expansive universe is that in whatever corner of the galaxy, there's your guys, the people that you want to play with, the people that have your story, your Space Marine Legion, your Imperial Guard Regiment, your Xenos, faction. They're there, and it's contradictory in a way, because on the one hand, the Games Workshop tells you can represent your character. Your general is your big miniature on the tabletop. But then if you're someone who deviates from what the game gives you, you have to go out of your way to feel as if you were on the table. You have to go out of your way to.
Yeah, it's very true. Fandom and the fans do not like you going away from deviating too much in specific ways, though, which I think is interesting. Because if I made a Celestial Lions a kitbash, right, with some African visual language involved, they would be like, oh, okay, that's cool. Or again, the Tal Marines. Mostly I got comments about how that's cool. But those don't challenge the reactionary fans in a way that female Space Marines do, because those, it's a boys' club. And there is a strain among a lot of fandoms. You can see this a lot with something like Gamergate from a couple of years ago, where any attempt to include people of other identities is viewed as an attack on them. The fan base is very reactionary.
Yeah.
what's viewed as an attack on their identity, and that identity is a boys' club. And so it's that classic thing where if you start up to other people, it's viewed as an attack on them, even though it's not. Like
Yeah.
women don't have cooties, you know?
Yeah, you think that for all the talk that these guys do about, they feel ostracized from society, right? They feel as if they are, their interest in 40K makes them a weirdo, right? And maybe to some degree, it is a little bit weird, how much they might fixate over it. But the point is, if Warhammer was more inclusive, if Warhammer was more universal, then you guys would be the cool kids. You would be the cool guys, you guys would be the hip ones. But instead, you want to preserve this blanket of safety by smothering yourself in what you know and rejecting anything that is different.
I think that's why it's important to have voices that are more liberal in terms of the hobby. Because I do think there's a lot of young people in the hobby, a lot of young men who really just need to be exposed a little bit more to other ideas and are still young enough that they're forming opinions.
Yeah, I'm not going to profess that I was born like a perfect, socialist or whatever. I had a more of a reactionary phase in my youth, and it was exposure to different ideas and being challenged on my ideas that ultimately made me realize, hey, all of the things that I was thinking is wrong. I need to do better, right? And it's true for many of these guys.
The same way.
Yeah, very few of us are lucky enough to be born in a position where we just get it. We have parents that teach us, right from wrong in a way that is inclusive.
It is that much so. I think one way I heard of describing it once that I thought was accurate was that if you're born into, for example, a racist society, your default views will be of that of the society, and therefore they will be racist. And you have to do work to undo that and think about and to kind of move against the stream.
Yeah, you have to. Now, for some people, it's easier than others. If you are an LGBT person, if you're a trans person, you are going to feel very different from cis people, and you are going to, necessarily feel more of a desire to break away from the conditioning of society. But it's nevertheless a universal thing. A good example of this are AdMech, the Adeptus Mechanicus. There's a disconnection between how AdMech are talked about and how they talk about themselves. The AdMech are always like, the flesh is weak. We reject the biological, etc., etc. I'm gonna turn myself into a toaster. And when you think about that, what is it really? They are a genderless society, or at least they have no need for pronouns. They have no need for concepts like gender because they are a post-gender society, because they're transhuman, right? An entire society of people dedicated to worship of a machine, and turns out machines don't really have a need for gender. But if you go into a Warhammer community and then say, okay, well, I think all of the AdMech should use maybe they them pronouns, or maybe they should have their own kind of pronoun, because why would they think about gender in the way that we think about gender? You will get shouted at. You will get resistance, and that is just it's weird to me. It's a disconnection from the lore and how people are interpreting it.
That's actually kind of fascinating. I hadn't thought of that in terms of them and pronouns, but that entirely makes sense and is consistent with the way they think all flesh is weak.
Yeah,
it's interesting too, because another issue I had, my first conversion video was actually trying to do a tech priestess, because I thought there's theoretically speaking, pretty much all AdMech models could be female under that.
You never know.
The ropes, right? But again, in terms of, I think that's a valid interpretation, but also men and women are built differently. So I thought it would be interesting to have so one of the things I really like about the AdMech is the way that their tech priests are kind of hunched and wizened and like just they're husks of their old bodies, right? Yeah. So I thought it'd be cool to have a female version of that. Obviously not sexualized, just kind of almost like an old crone or hag.
Something you don't really often see. Because you get old men, but you don't really get old women.
It would be really cool to have like an old crone one, and that was nearly impossible to do because there are almost no models that aren't attractive women. And so I finally am working on one now. I was able to find a Nurgle witch who's like kind of fat and hunched over, and I'm using her as a base, and
Oh, that's
it's
going to be
turning out really
interesting.
cool. And but it's interesting because it's something where the mech are one way in the lore, and then they're not necessarily represented that way on the tabletop. And then if you try to bring into your representation of them, you are very much attacked.
Yeah, exactly. And I think uniquely, it's kind of an issue for the Imperium because if you run down the list of the factions in Warhammer 40k, recently you've got the Necrons, but they are mechanical species. They don't have biological sort of markers that could really be used to differentiate. I mean, sure, many of the Necron models are coded male. That is certainly a problem, but it's very difficult to tell one Necron from another, really, because that's kind of the point. They are mechanized and like that. Then you've got Eldar. Both kinds of Eldar are surprisingly, gender representative. Granted, many of the female Dark Eldar are wearing like metal bikinis, but there are many models that aren't, doing that kind of thing. And interestingly, for the Eldar, I've often heard it described that a male Eldar can, join, like for example, the Banshees, and then while they are a Banshee, they assume the female aspect. So it's clear that in their society, they've kind of moved away from gender, as a strict determinant. And it's represented fairly well. You've got a good mix of units that are male and female, and not overly sexualized. Although there is a little bit of it. I think that's kind of baked into the entire system.
Yeah, it's very much that 70s, 80s kind of tabletop miniature that just hasn't gone away, where women are in chainmail bikinis a lot.
And then you've got orcs. The orcs are again genderless, although they use he/him pronouns often. Maybe that's something that could be addressed.
Theoretically. It's funny because I've heard people argue this, that they're just sentient fungi.
Yeah.
And that's true. But they are so heavily gendered in their representation that to me it's almost silly to say that they're not male, because they are all referred to, with he, him pronouns. They have the very cisgendered body type of a male. And no one treats them as genderless. They're very clearly an all-male race.
Yeah.
Even if they aren't.
Yeah, and they embody a kind of masculine ideal, about ultraviolence and
very much so.
And it's very difficult to look at them and go, okay, well, do orcs not have orc pronouns, or what's going on there? But then, to step away, I mean, you've got chaos, and chaos is kind of a mess. Many of the problems that Space Marines have, the Chaos Space Marines have in abundance, because they are the same in a way. But then you have like races like the Tyranids, where the Tyranids have no concept of personality. There are no individuals in that species, just teeth. So you can get away with that. We talked about the AdMech. The idea that I like, the one that I'm very curious about, is Tau, because recently, I'm not sure if you noticed this, but some of the Tau models are supposed to be female. Like the Tau heads are different to the male heads. They have a different facial structure, like a different nose configuration or something like that. And that's meant to be, there are female and male Tau in the fire cost, in the engineering cost, etc., and that kind of evens it out, because they're not like us, so they don't have as many visual markers, but they do have distinctly heads that are just included in the base sprue. Oh, this is a male head, this is a female head,
Yeah.
So it's a weird problem, because ultimately you and I, we can have this actually admittedly very nice conversation about different parts about lore. We can circle the wagon of arguments. We can say, well, Fabius Bile could do it. Why can't the Imperium? Maybe they should have done the Primaris Marines differently. Maybe we should have more models that, maybe we shouldn't have just one female faction, for the Imperium, because they are going to be the one that is most familiar to players, right? For a number of different reasons. And we can have these arguments, right? But ultimately, it puts us in a very difficult position, because many of the people who need to hear these arguments are not going to hear them. Shout out to any Games Workshop employees who are listening to this podcast. But how this is why I think your channel is particularly a good thing, right? Because you in making that female space marine, in deciding you upfront you said it. I don't really care what the lore says. I want to use the design language of Warhammer 40K, and I want to do something that just is different. And I feel like if you continue to do these things, if you continue to push these kinds of boundaries, you can really, open people's eyes. That's just sort of my feeling. Do you feel the same?
Really do. I feel like, especially after getting so much hate on that video. Well, I got some hate. A lot of people were just disagreeing. I feel like I'm actually probably going to push forward more with doing these kinds of things because I think it's important to open people's minds. And, again, this is a hobby that should be large and sprawling and open for everyone.
Yeah,
and I really like the world, and I think more people should be able to be included in it.
Yeah, the thing is, a lot of people on the other side of this conversation, they have this idea that what we want is we want to destroy 40K. No, that's absolutely not the reason why we're having this conversation. What we want to do is make 40K more popular. We want more people to be interested in it. We want more people to be having conversations about it because A, I want more people to play against, and B, when you have more people having the conversation, it can go, many, many more places. We can have people who are writing stories that really, A, broaden the horizons of what 40K is, but B, also make us question it, make us think about it more, because I don't just play 40K because I, have murder fantasies. I don't. But I well, that's what this will go down as evidence at the trial.
So we'll cut this part out.
Yeah, oops, cut it. But I play 40K because I am fascinated by these questions that it makes me want to ask. Can human society exist on the scale that it does? Do we have to sacrifice what makes us good, for survival? How should we feel about, other people? How should we feel about other races? How should we feel about ourselves, And 40K is a great setting to explore these ideas and concepts because A, it's fake, and B, it's just, I hate to say this, but it's very beautiful. The aesthetics of Warhammer 40K are, let me tell you something. One of the first models that I genuinely fell in love with was one of the Sisters of Battle, and this is going to sound weird, but one of their early Exorcist tanks. Now, for modern listeners, you won't know this because the Exorcist tank has kind of evolved and changed, and in my opinion, for the worst. But initially, it was a tank, a rhino, but on top of it is a organ, and a Sister of Battle has to sit at the organ and play it to shoot rockets from the organ itself. And I thought, that's amazing. There's no other setting where I could get here's a science fiction tank, but here's an organ that shoots rockets. And I just thought to myself, that is a really interesting model. And then when I started to look more into the Sisters of Battle, that's when I realized, oh, okay, so that's not as interesting as I thought it was going to be. But you see what I'm saying here. There is potential here for this to really be for everyone, and for everyone in a way that I think
that model too.
Oh yeah,
it's a great model.
Yeah, it's a great model. There are actually genuinely, particularly interesting models. One of the models that I really, really like that's recent is the Inquisitor Kyrias model. I'm sure you've seen it. She's the Ordo Xenos one. And she wears black power armor that has an alien skull, and she has Eldar weaponry, and she's got a little dragon. I think it's really cool. It's a really cool looking model.
I've seen that one. I love that one.
Yeah, I love it too.
I really love that one.
I want to buy one just because I think it's such an interesting looking model, because it plays with so many different ideas of what it means to be 40K, there are people who, vehemently are opposed to the idea that, an Inquisitor could look the way that she does, but she looks interesting. She looks like an actual character that has an actual story to tell, She looks more alien than human, and yet she's a alien hunting Inquisitor, She wears power armor that kind of looks human, and you can kind of see some of the design language of the Imperium, but then you look at it a little bit more, and it's like, is this really human? Did we really make this? And, she has an Eldar weapon, and it's cool. And I wish more of 40K was like that, because the more homogenized, the more commodified it becomes, to sell to its audience of, I hate to say this, but, largely reactionary dude bros, the worse it becomes. right? Um, yeah,
Very true, and I think it's something that early Warhammer really embraced. That those early Rogue Trader days when you just had
yeah,
weird looking models, and
yeah,
it's interesting because a lot of converters like going back to those that concept art they had back then and trying to mimic them.
yeah.
There's
Back
a
in
whole
the
movement called Blanchitsu that's about a specific artist called, I think, Blanchitsu. I don't remember his name exactly, but trying to mimic his really weird looking concept art in the actual models themselves.
yeah, I like that early period of stuff so much that I've got a project going on. Uh, Plug my own project. I'm making some rules for a game I'm calling Techno Barbarians, and the whole idea is to really play with the idea that the early period of humanity's history in the 40k world, where before we were all united into the Imperium, is a very disparate and very interesting design language. You've got people that could be Mad Max style barbarians next to people that could be wearing glittering armor and look kind of a lot like Space Marines, but maybe they are robots or maybe they're some other weird experiment. And it's just I think there's a lot of potential there. But we are running out of time. Let me say that you are definitely one of my most interesting guests. I would love to have you on, to continue these conversations because it's very rare to find someone who is, fairly left-leaning in the community, and it's also rare to find someone who's very talented in doing what you do and making sort of these kit bashes. Would you like to
Let's get
plug
back on
anything?
sometime. I think it's so valuable what you're doing.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Well, so
I
my
try.
channel,
I will include a
you can
link
see
to the channel in the description of the video.
definitely, if you want to check out the conversions, come take a look at those. I will be doing at some point more female Space Marines, so you can come and view the controversy in the comments. But yeah, that's about it.
If I can if I can plug a suggestion, I would really like to see like some Middle Eastern or maybe like Indo-Persian, maybe like a Space Marine or an Imperial Guardsman, because I think there are some like Talaran Desert Raiders, but I'd really like to see like a lot of that, especially for like the White Scars, because some of their language and stuff like that is Eastern, but it's like a homogenized version of the East. But yeah, please check out Kitbosh. Great channel, even better kit bashes. You can find bite marks, on Spotify, probably wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube. Like the video, comment. Maybe tell us what your favorite model is. We'd love to hear from you. You can check us out on Patreon. And yeah, please look forward to more of these special episodes. We will definitely be having Kitbosh on some other time. Any last words?
Nope, just thank you for having me on. This was a blast.
Yeah, it was. Thank you. Good night, everyone. Be well.